right, so we sort of arrived at our last talk. Two long days, but fantastic talks so far. We of course paired the previous talk purposely with what's to come. We didn't quite know how well the previous results would have replicated. It would have been a little bit awkward if the previous paper would have found like none of your great paper results actually hold up, right? So I'm sure Leo is also sort of happy that this holds up. Just a couple things. As an exercise, right? When you have time, go on Leo's website, try to find a paper that is not amazing. Like it's not going to happen because Leo has been doing such fantastic work in the field, and he is a superstar in the field, and he's been covering so many important topics on peer effects and polarization and norms. It just, the list goes on and on. I actually don't think Leo knows what it's like to not publish in a top 5 journal, because it feels like that's essentially all he does. And so I've admired Leo from afar, right? So there's overlaps in my research interests. I've admired him from afar. I've never met him in person until last night. And so then we were over dinner, and so he came, and I was really getting angry at the fact that not only is he a stellar scholar, but also like a very great, nice person. And I was like, Leo, like, why don't you leave some stuff for all of us, right? So just, leave some room for the other people. And So the reality is that we're extremely excited to have him. He gave us a little bit of a preview of what he's going to talk about. We should aspire to do like great sort of work in the field the way he does. And I have a few friends, close friends, who collaborate with him, and I'm so jealous of them that they get to work with him. And I hope at some point Leo is just going to take pity on me and just like invite me on collaborations. So Leo, thanks so much for coming. It's fantastic to have you. We're super excited to see you talk.
Thank you. Now, Kurt, it's a very, very, very generous introduction, and you're bound to be disappointed after this. My talk. But thanks for inviting me. This has been a wonderful conference. So this is going to be social norms, economic behavior from suppression to expression. So I'll be talking a little bit, giving a little bit of an overview of some of the work that my co-authors and I have been doing on this topic, kind of some sort of overview. Then I'm going to zoom in some specific paper that we're currently working on. And there's going to be more coming from the econ side of things. So I already kind of anticipate that we'll take more this approach. So just to get started, is this supposed to work? Sorry. Wait. That's the other way around.
Yes,
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So the question I'm going to be asking here today. The first question is, what extent are individuals' decisions, important economic decisions, affected by their concerns about their social image? Okay. I'm going to talk about some work very briefly, just describe very briefly, some work on identifying, measuring, interpreting these social image effects across a variety of settings, starting from educational decisions among high school students to labor market decisions to consumption behavior. Just kind of describe a little bit of a review of the recent work on the econ side that has been done on this subject. That's the first part. And then I'm going to zoom in and talk more about the second part, because I think most of the talk is going to be about this. Which is, okay, so first is about understanding how individuals, like on the micro sense, are affected by these concerns when they're making important decisions. Now, if you zoom out and look more in terms of a macro approach, in a given society, social norms influence the social sanctions or rewards that are associated with certain behaviors or opinions, right? And they can therefore shape the social image concerns that described first. So I'm going to talk about some work on how social image effects can be reshaped. So first we identify them, we measure them, we interpret them, and then now I think the next step of this agenda is to kind of how to reshape them. A lot of work discussed here during this conference has also touched upon these issues. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of misperceptions and the correction of these misperceptions. And then some more recent work, I'm going to spend more time talking about this, on the dissemination of rationales and justifications to facilitate the expression of dissenting views. Okay? Kind of the agenda of what we're going to be talking about. Of course, this work, just to build on a lot of different literatures, is again economics theoretical literature on social signaling and social behavior and on conformative. There's a long literature on lab experiments and field experiments on social pressure in econ. Also, of course, a long psychology literature on suppression and conformative, and of course, a literature on social norms and culture. The main leaders in the field are in the room here too. So, this just to describe what this relates to. So, in terms of identifying social image effects, I'm going to start with just a little bit of notation, just to kind of organize our thoughts, because I think a lot of the experiments are going to be focusing on different terms of this social image term. Okay, so based on the seminal work by Roland Benabou and Jean Tirole, we have just put together this very simple equation that kind of really is what we're trying to target with our experiments. So so this is the social image term in individual's I utility function vis-a-vis group J. All right. So we think individual I within this reference group J is undertaking a visible action, which is a binary action, just to start to fix ideas, that might reveal some information about I's type. Okay, so again, binary. Individual I might be either low type or high type, and people are making inference about the type when you observe the action that the individual is undertaking. Being of type H is more socially desirable within reference group J than being of type L. Okay, that's so people are trying to signal that they're a high type. So just very simply, the reason why I put this equation, because it allows us to see the different terms that we can target with different interventions. Okay, there's no. Okay, so the first, starting from the last one, this is the inference terms. It's the probability that other individuals within the reference group think that the individual I type H is a high type condition observing the choice of action. So if I do an action, what is the inference that other people are making about my type? Okay, so that's the inference part. This term in the middle is the expectation that the individual has about the social desirability of being seen by group J as type H. So my expectation about how people are going to judge me, what they're going to think of me if I undertake this action and they see it. Now, we put the expectation term here because, as you can see, many times people might be off in their expectations. That's when you have misperceptions. I think that people are going to find it desirable or going to appreciate me if I do this, but I might be wrong. Okay, so that creates opportunities for interventions here too. And this first term here, what we call lambda ij, is how much individual I cares about being perceived by group J as being of type H. Just we allow for heterogeneity, how much people care about their social image within this group. Okay? If it's 0, if you don't care, this whole term disappears. There's no social image concern. Okay? That's kind of how we're going to be thinking about it, because different experiments will relate to different terms. Okay, so there has been recently a growth in the literature in economics in understanding the social image concerns in the field, evidence that they matter for charitable giving and political donations. They matter for voting. People care about being seen as a good citizen, so they vote potentially for that. There's recent evidence in developing countries, very recent work on how parents' desire to signal that they're good parents could be used as a tool for incentivizing child immunization. Some work also on wage setting in developing countries. So there's a growing literature on the social image concerns and how they could also potentially be used as a policy tool. I will describe here kind of the first generation of papers that I have worked on with different co-authors on this subject. The ideal manipulation here for this type of experiment is to take an action within a social context and manipulate the visibility of the action, whether or not it's visible, so the social image concerns could be activated, and cross-manipulate the audience, right? Because if you want to establish that the effect is not driven just because something observable, but because something observable by an audience that will judge it a certain way. So in an ideal experiment, you vary the visibility and you cross-vary the potential audience, right? So using the different variations of these designs, we have studied the effect of peer pressure in education, the extent to which high school students were foregoing opportunities that could help them get into college because they're worried about seeing as not cool, as being seen as nerds. So we did a couple papers on trying to understand the mechanisms behind this. We have done some work on gender norms and labor market investments in the US, how concerns about how single women might feel like that if they, given the gender norms that still exist in the US, how they feel like if they invest, if they undertake some visible actions that would signal that they're ambitious and driven and assertive, that could actually backfire in the dating market, and how they would forego these opportunities in the labor market in order to signal something in the dating market. We have done some work also on how we can identify these considerations for conspicuous consumption, how people might actually buy purchasing goods with the purpose of signaling to others that they're successful and rich, and understand some of the consequences this could have in terms of this rat race. Some field experiments we've done in Indonesia. Also some work on keeping up with the Joneses more broadly. So I spent a fair amount of time working on these issues, trying to identify these social image concerns in the field, and trying to interpret them and establish that they're really important for important decisions using field work. So with that in mind, I think the next goal of what we've been working on is really trying to understand how to reshape these social image effects, right? So remember, we had this equation, right, where we had the different terms of the social image term in the utility function. And I think, if you start from, there are different ways. If you believe that kind of decomposition of the social image term, you could try to target the first term, which is lambda, which is like how much people care about others. If you zero that, then you turn off mechanically social image concerns. So I think it would be cool to do more work on the subject. There's some evidence that once you make people feel better about themselves, or improve their self-esteem, the sense of self-worth, they seem to care less about the opinions of others. So potentially it could be some interventions along those lines. And then there are a couple of other things that you could do when you think about the other terms. For example, you could change the beliefs about how others would judge their action. And there's a potential role of misperceptions here. If these beliefs are off, that's a simple lever, right? It's like, okay, I thought that people would judge me negatively for doing this, and I was wrong. So then maybe I could behave in a certain way. So we'll discuss some of the work on correcting these misperceptions that builds on the long literature on pluralistic ignorance. And then you can also change the last term, which is other people's ability to infer type from your behavior. Now, one very mechanical way to turn this off or to affect this is to manipulate visibility. Make things that are typically observable, you make them unobservable. So then people cannot make an inference about your type because they're not observing the action, right? That's one thing. The other one, which is what I'm going to be talking about mostly later in this talk, is about things like the provision of rationales. There are things that could be done that can change how people are going to make inferences about your type, okay? So they might interpret differently your motivation behind a certain action, even if it's observable. And we'll discuss that, okay? That's kind of the agenda of what we're going to be talking about. So changing beliefs about other and social norms. Of course, there's a long literature in social psychology with the idea of pluralistic ignorance. I think most people in the room know what we're talking about here. When I talk this to a pure econ crowd, I have to spend like 10 minutes walking through the logic of pluralistic ignorance. So I'm assuming that people know. And the interesting thing about pluralistic ignorance is an equilibrium that once you tell people the truth, things can change pretty fast because it was based on equilibrium was based on incorrect perceptions. So you can actually potentially lead to fast changes in behavior if the equilibrium was based on these incorrect perceptions about how others view a certain subject. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about two papers that we have done on this topic, studying two ways in which this equilibrium of pluralistic ignorance can quickly change. One way that we discussed in his first paper is a naturally occurring process through which beliefs can be updated. And we'll discuss here elections. So it is possible in a democracy, there are referenda, there are elections, there are polls, many things that can potentially aggregate information, right? So we're studying here the process through which Donald Trump's rise in popularity and eventual electoral victory in 2016 actually led people to update on the social acceptability of being like a xenophobe, being intolerant. Okay, so there happened to be a candidate that launched a campaign that focused a lot on these issues. And our idea there was like, when people observed that Trump was very popular, they were updating their heads about the popularity of these positions, right? So we do two types of experiments. And a lot of these papers I'm working on now we try to focus on the two sides of the communication, the person who's the sender, like expressing an opinion, and the receiver, the person who's judging the opinion, like the other person, right? So what we show, we study the causal effect of Trump's rise in popularity on senders' willingness to publicly express anti-immigration views. So when people update about Trump's popularity, do they update about the popularity, the acceptability of expressing these views, and do they feel more comfortable expressing them in public? That's one side. But then we also study the other side, which I think is less obvious and potentially more interesting, which is, okay, if I was a closeted xenophobe and now I feel more comfortable saying those things once I learn about the social environment in which I'm at, there is also the other side, which is, suppose you're someone who's actually tolerant, you don't like xenophobes, and you're judging someone for expressing these types of positions. What we're going to argue here is that even that person, so suppose I say, okay, let's give you an example. Suppose I say something intolerant in a setting where our prior is that no one is an intolerant person. Your prior, you're going to be from my type thinking, I must be a real bigot because I'm saying this in a setting where everyone's going to be judging me negatively. So you update your perception is that I'm a bigot. Now, suppose I say something tolerant in a setting where we now think there are a lot of bigots out there, right? So now you're not so sure about how bigoted I am anymore because, oh, maybe you're saying those things because he feels like he has to say those things because that's the setting where he's at. So you, even if you don't like bigot, you might give me a pass because you're not so sure about my type anymore. Okay, so that's part of what is dangerous about what's going on. Is like intolerant people feel more comfortable expressing intolerant views. Intolerant people are would be less likely to judge intolerance for expressing those views. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, we ran some experiments back in the day around the election 2016, where we randomly updated people's perceptions about Donald Trump's popularity in their home state. And we asked whether they would be willing to authorize a donation to an anti-immigration organization. And this was either a private, like unobservable donation, or a publicly observable donation. What we see is that in the absence of the information updating positively the perceptions about Trump's popularity locally, we see this kind of embarrassment effect, like about 20 percentage point difference between the willingness to donate in private or in public. Now, once you update their views about Trump's popularity, we see that this gap disappears. Suddenly, they're no longer embarrassed. Okay, and if you redo the same experiment a week after the election, just looking at what happened, without doing experimental manipulations, just using the passage of time as the substitute, we see that this embarrassment has also disappeared. That's kind of just the first experiment we ran as a proof of concept about how this election actually could have this effect on changing these norms about this type of behavior. We then replicated this with a much larger experiment after the election by manipulating people's perceptions. We went to an area where Clinton won the county and Trump won the metropolitan area, and we manipulated people's perceptions of who was more popular locally by giving them either one piece of information or the other, right? Even after the election, just manipulating the perception of who was more popular locally. And again, we see something very similar. When they think that they live in an area broadly where Clinton won, there's this embarrassment, there's a lower take-up rate, the donation rate, and this disappears when they think that now they're living in an area where Trump won. So they feel less embarrassed to make this type of action. Then we have another experiment where we ask Democrats to allocate, to either give money to whether they would like to donate to the candidate, whether they would like to donate money to a participant from a previous survey, and we tell them that that participant donated money to an anti-immigration organization. So we use an actual participant from the previous survey, and we tell them that person lives in an area where Clinton won and made a donation in private or made a donation public, well, that person lives in an area where Trump won and the donation was in private or in public. Here's what we think. If the person donated, lived in an area where Clinton won, whether they donated in private or public, your inference that person probably is intolerant. They are doing this in an area where they will be judged negatively for doing it. So you judge them negatively, and you're more likely to not donate money to them. Okay, this is the share of those who don't donate. If you think that person won donated in an area where Trump won and it's in private, you still think they're a bigot, right? In private, they're doing what they think they want to do, right? So it's very similar number. But if you're told that they come from an area where Trump won and the donation was in public, suddenly you become nicer to them. It's like, okay, maybe they felt pressure to donate. Maybe they're just in this area where this is how they're supposed to behave now. So this is, a person who doesn't like the participant who made this donation being more generous to them, just because now they understand that they're coming in a setting where this is the expected behavior. Okay, so this is kind of we're thinking about the process of inference changing. Okay, then we also have a paper. This is going to sound pretty repetitive, even the previous talk, but I think it's interesting to contrast with the previous paper, which is we're thinking about a democracy where at some point we might expect information to be aggregated through the electoral process, through referendum, through some sort of polling that gets disseminated. But in non-democracies, pluralistic ignorance might be sustained for longer periods, right? Because, say in Saudi Arabia, we don't expect any vote on this, any referendum. So people might be less likely to learn the true state of the world. So we studied whether the topic of whether women should be allowed to work outside of home and asked whether Saudi Arabia has experienced pluralistic ignorance. And then we try to measure that and try to see what happens when you correct these misperceptions. Okay? So we find, we run a number of experiments. The first one being an experiment with a number of young married males who are sitting in a room together with their neighbors. So people that they know. We're not asking them about random people in society. We're asking them about their neighbors. And we see that the vast majority of them underestimate the extent to which the neighbors support agree with the opinion that women should be allowed to work outside of home. We have over 80% of men, 87 in the sample, who think that women should be allowed to work outside of home, but they vastly underestimate support by their neighbors. Then what we do in this first experiment is that we randomly correct these misperceptions. And the first outcome that we look at is their willingness to sign up their wife for an app that helps them get jobs. It's like a job service, okay? And it's a real decision because they have to choose between that or a cash payment. We just wanted to see a proof of concept that you could actually change by revealed preference some behavior. And we do see this movement, okay? More of these men are willing to sign up their wife for this app that will help them get a job. Okay, this seems to map into longer term outcomes. We see that the wives of these males are more likely to have applied for a job 4 months later, interviewed for jobs. We don't have enough significance to look at whether they were employed outside of home 5 months later, but it seems to be moving in the same direction. And here we have a little bit of a spillover analysis here, looking at whether they would be willing to let their wives take driving lessons. Okay, and we do see this change in behavior 5 months later. Then would have ended there, but we thought, well, what if we could have just stumbled upon a sample of men for which this was true, right? So we wanted to see if this was true across the board in Saudi Arabia. So we did 2 national surveys that are representative to see if we could replicate this finding, and we did. Most young men in Saudi Arabia are supportive of women working outside of home. We also did other elicitation methods, like list experiments, to make sure we're not capturing just social desirability bias. This also seems to be very similar to what was found in our barometer in 2010, indicating that maybe this pluralistic ignorance equilibrium has been there for about 10 years at least. We also find evidence that lack of discussion of the topic on whether women should be allowed to work outside of home strongly correlates with misperception. So when people think this is taboo, they don't talk to their friends about it, and they have stronger misperceptions. And we find these pretty strong patterns. And then we try to do something else which is, okay, how could you make an actionable policy out of this? So we tried to do like a little toy Mickey Mouse policy experiment where we decided, okay, we teamed up with a survey company that hired women to do these surveys, to be surveyors. And the company has two versions of the job. One version where you call people from home, and another version of the same job where you go out to the street and interview people. So we thought it was nice because you hold a lot of things fixed, the company, the job, but you vary whether it's at home or outside of home, right? So this company recruited a number of women that would be interested in doing the at-home version of the job. And then after they say that they'll be interested, the company tells them, there's a different version of the same job, and you will get paid 25% more if you do it, but it's outside of home. And you randomize whether the company tells them information from our previous results, that men actually are okay with women working outside of home. Just to see if that changes their decision to, and they're more likely to take the job. And it seems to have a big effect. So we basically double the share of women who choose to work outside of home for this temporary job once they learn that men are okay with it. And then this is the fraction of them actually show up to do the job, if you want to have like more like hard data. So this is like more of a proof of concept of the potential for using this as a policy tool. This is very specific context, short-term job, but that could illustrate the potential for these types of information provision experiments actually or interventions to get more women to work outside of home in these settings. Now, is Saudi Arabia an anomaly? Maybe first I thought that maybe that sample was an anomaly. Maybe we can ask ourselves whether the whole country that we're studying happened to be an anomaly. So we collected data from 60 countries in partnership with Gallup. We added a new module, about 70,000 observations, covers about over 80% of the population in the world. And here's what we find. For example, if you ask both men and women whether women should be allowed to work outside of home, and we find across the board that men across the world seem to be very supportive of women working outside of home. Now the misperceptions are massive around the world. So if you ask every single country that we study, people underestimate the extent to which men support this topic, right? It doesn't seem like Saudi Arabia is an anomaly. It seems to be vastly underestimated across the world. We also ask the same question to women. Of course, we see that across the world, women strongly support women working outside of home, and there's still some much weaker, but there's still some underestimation of the support that women have about this. We also, this is work in progress. My co-author presented this yesterday for the first time, so we have some other stuff there. For the interest of time, I'm going to skip here. But we also have questions on whether people's opinions on whether women should be given priority for leadership positions. And there we seem to find a kind of interesting pattern where in more gender progressive countries, people overestimate support that others have for this, especially support from women. So they think that most women want this type of affirmative action when actually women don't seem to want it as much. So it seems to flip the direction of pluralistic ignorance in those countries. So we seem to have these two types of equilibrium going on in the world in the gender progressiveness scale. So we're currently working on expanding knowledge about this perception of gender norms around the world. Now the question, okay, maybe it's something about gender only, right? Is this more widespread? So we did this meta-analysis of the whole literature. It just came out in the annual review of economics, showing that these misperceptions in economics, psychology, sociology, political science, we just collected, we bugged a lot of people to get their data, and we did this meta-analysis, and we find that they're really widespread, these misperceptions, across contexts, across societies, across topics, and they seem to be asymmetric in the sense that they seem to be all kind of on the same direction in the given country. It's not like they're like all over the places. Countries seem to kind of pull in one direction or context, people pull in one direction for a given topic. And the misperception is stronger about outgroups. It's another strong pattern that we have. People seem to misunderstand outgroups more than their in-groups. And we find evidence that a lot of these treatments to correct these perceptions generally work, but especially those are qualitative and narrative ones. Like when you give people data, they're less likely to respond than when you give them a story or some example, some anecdotes, something more qualitative, seem to resonate more. So I think there's definitely a lot of work that we could do along those issues. So then, okay, so all right, so we talked about misperceptions. Well, if there are misperceptions, one way to change behavior potentially easily is about correcting these misperceptions. That seems to be like the easiest case, like the low-hanging fruit. What about the cases where there's no misperception, where you understand how, you know, the share of other, like the extent to which other people support or disagree with a certain opinion, but you know, you're worried about expressing it, right? So we have this recent work on the importance of rationales in the setting. So we're studying dissent and how people can justify their dissent. So we think that dissent is an important force for and against social change. And rationales have been systematically used in history by political entrepreneurs, social movements, and the media, and in order to enable dissent by shaping the public debate. So let's pick two controversial topics right now on the two sides of the political spectrum. For example, whether you know, the discussion on whether there should be police reform, whether, you know, sorry, on campus arriving here today, for example, this is an active debate. And whether police reform would increase violent crimes, for example. It's rationale to oppose police reform because it could increase violent crimes. Or, for example, also related to crimes, more on the right of the political spectrum, whether immigrants are violent criminals that will come into the country and increase crime. Okay? Those are things, those are narratives that have been used potentially to justify some specific political views, political positions. So why do these rationales work at enabling dissent? People typically think of mechanism of persuasion. You know, maybe I wasn't really sure about how to think of this issue. Now you tell me that you give me a rationale that police reform would increase violent crime. Maybe that sways me, that moves me in one direction, that changes my opinion, persuades. But turns out that dissent is often limited not due to a lack of support for the cause, but rather by fear of the consequences of expressing it. Maybe the reason people are not speaking out is not because they don't agree with your opinion, but rather because they're worried about how they're going to be sanctioned socially if they express that opinion. 62% of Americans nowadays agree with the statement that the political climate these days prevents me from saying things I believe because others will find them offensive. So, you know, there seems to be something about that there. So how do we take this to this paper? Well, we study another mechanism through which rationales can affect public behavior, which we call the social cover effect. What's the logic of the social cover effect? Well, let's take the example of defunding the police. Maybe in many settings, there could be large sanctions associated with expressing this view. People might think of you, if you say that you're against defunding the police or against reforming the police, people might think that you're against racial equality. They might think you're a bigot. They might judge you for that. Okay? Now, suppose there's an argument popularized claiming that the police defunding will increase violent crime. And people know about this argument. So now more people may publicly oppose defunding due to persuasion. Maybe some people change their opinion and said, oh, that's a good argument. I'm against it now. This is private persuasion. There could be anticipated persuasion. Said, I think some of my audience will be persuaded, so they're going to give me less of a hard time if I say that. So expected persuasion of your audience. Or it could be social cover effect. The availability of the rationale and people's awareness that I've been exposed to the rationale opens up new explanation for my position. Or maybe he's against it because he's really worried about crime. Maybe he was persuaded by this rationale. So maybe they might think less negatively about me if I express this position, once they know that I have been exposed to this rationale. It provides me social cover. Now, this is interesting thing about social cover is that it could be something legitimate, or it could be something that I use strategically. I want people to think that I've been exposed because that allows me to say a bunch of stuff without being judged, right? So that could be used strategically as well. So something similar could be happening on the conservative side, you know. If it's easier, could be easier for conservatives to say that they're against undocumented immigration if they can evoke a rationale that says that immigration causes crime, right? Just, okay, maybe he's worried about crimes, maybe he's really risk averse, maybe he really believed this rationale, okay? So how do we do this? We ran these experiments on Twitter where we try to isolate the social cover effect of rationales and also show how the availability of rationale shift perceptions and social sanctions. Okay, so again, do an experiment on both sides of communication. So how do we do this? We do this both for liberals expressing support for against opposition to the defunding the police movement, and also conservative support for deporting undocumented immigrants, just to see controversial things and how the availability of rationales helps them. This is what we find. So we run this experiment with Democrats, independents on Twitter. Everyone sees this rationale, which is an article written by a Princeton criminology professor arguing that defunding the police will increase violent crime. And this is, so we thought this was a good rationale, pretty credible because it's written by a professor at Princeton. It was published in the Washington Post, which is a liberal outlet. So we figured, let's see if that works, right? And then after they see it, they are asked whether to join whether to join a campaign to oppose defunding the police. So and then we condition on that. Those who said that they would like to join this campaign privately, we showed them the article a second time. And then we asked them whether they would authorize the posting of a tweet with a petition to oppose defunding the police. And our experimental manipulation is to vary the availability of social cover, holding the other mechanisms constant. How do we do this? Well, first we need to hold fixed persuasion. Well, we take care of that because everyone reads the article. So if the article has a direct effect, that's taken care of. Anticipated persuasion of the audience. Well, take care of it because both versions of the tweet include the article. So your audience will see the article. So we vary the social cover by varying whether the tweet communicates that the respondent was exposed to the rationale before or after joining the campaign. Turns out both things are true because they see the article twice. So that was the trick we did. So this is the two versions of the tweet. In the cover condition, they say, I have joined a campaign to oppose defunding the police. Before joining, I was shown this article written by a Princeton professor on the strong scientific evidence that defunding the police will increase violent crime. So before joining, and here's the same, but if we say after joining, so everything is held fixed. You just change one word, whether the audience thinks that you saw this before or after you joined, whether you had a social cover or not. The interest of time, well, I'll skip how we actually implemented this. This was a real decision that they were authorizing us to post this on their behalf through this extension to the browser. Here's what we find. The availability of the coverage is very one word, substantially increased the likelihood that they will post the tweet. It goes from 57 to about 70%. So there seems to be like, just by changing this one word, where the audience thinks that they saw this before, not after, increases the willingness to post this tweet. Then we spent a lot of time trying to argue that we're really getting at what we thought we were getting at. We do a placebo experiment with an identical manipulation in a non-stigmatized domain to rule out that there's a mechanical effect of the before-after wording. We also showed that they don't think that one tweet is more effective at convincing others than the other, that they don't think it's just that one language is more natural than the other. We also did this whole text exercise on textual analysis on why they would post one version versus another and see what comes to mind. And we saw that a lot of people, without being prompted, evoke the social cover mechanism, and substantially more when they have the before wording. So they seem to understand what's going on. So we think we're really getting at this. So then we look at the other side. How do people judge those who post one tweet versus another? So we run a super experiment. We recruit a large sample of Democrats, over 1,000 Democrats, and we show them to say, hey, you're matched with the previous survey participant who chose to post a tweet. And we randomize whether we show the screenshot of one version versus another. It's very simple. Just show one screenshot. And we ask them their willingness to deny bonus payment to that participant and inference about motives. Like, why do you think that? Trying to understand the person's motives. Here's what we find. People are significantly more likely to deny bonus payment to the other participant if they saw the no cover tweet than the cover tweets, which is consistent with people sanctioning others more when they don't have cover. We also asked them, what do you think is the probability that that person donated money to a pro-Black organization? And we see that you see someone who posted the version of the tweet with the cover, you think they're significantly more likely to have donated to a pro-Black organization. So that changes the inference about their factor and so on. Both sanction and inference. We also find evidence when you ask people, why do you think they made that donation? When you think about them with open-ended text, things line up pretty well. Now, the interesting thing here is that most Democrats actually oppose defunding the police, yet it seems that minorities, a vocal minority can shape the debate, right, by imposing the sanctions and so on. So we showed that rationales can facilitate dissent, but the question is just how difficult it is to justify dissent in this setting. So we run another experiment where we made the rationale a little bit weaker. Instead of saying, Princeton professor, scientific evidence, we keep the same article, but we just say this article showing, don't invoke Princeton professor and so on. And that's it, very similar. We just say, I was shown this article that argues that defunding the police will increase violent crime. Instead of saying Princeton professor, strong scientific evidence. And here's what happened. It doesn't work anymore. So unless you can invoke here a Princeton professor, scientific evidence, they're going to think poorly of you to express this view. So that shows how difficult it is. Rationales can facilitate dissent, but in some settings, there are strong limitations in their power, right? We might be in a world where unless you can strongly justify what you're saying, people are going to think poorly of you. They will punish you. We find everything on punishment, on actions, and so on with this. Then I'm running out of time. We did a similar experiment with Republicans, but instead of using a Princeton professor, we used Tucker Carlson. Making a statement here. And we find that very similar findings, like Democrats, so Republicans are much more likely to post when they can evoke, say that they saw Tucker Carlson before and not after, and Democrats punish Republicans less when they know that they saw Tucker Carlson before. So even people on the other side of the aisle giving you a pass, you know, if you can evoke some rationale. I think it's interesting too, because you know, rationales can have the power of changing inference and allowing the expression of controversial opinions. But you know, that's what we try to argue here. But you know, it's also interesting to understand what is considered credible on both sides of the political spectrum. It seems like on the Democratic side, the bar is much higher. So unless you can evoke something extremely credible, people are going to judge it negatively. Whereas people seem to be giving, you know, more of a pass for Republicans in terms of what rationales work to justify their opinion. So we think that's interesting. We think more work is needed. And we also discuss, you know, how can you silence a group by questioning the source of the rationale, or by trying to say, hey, you found this is because you're looking for this. You have an ulterior motive and so on. We also have some implications on how to debunk fake news. It might not be enough. Part of the reason why people are posting things is not just because they believe it, but because they think that the audience might think that they believe it. Then it might not be enough to just email the person, communicate to the person privately and say, oh, this has been debunked. This is not credible. You need to tell the person. Your audience will know that we told you, because you need to remove the social cover. So it's important, might be important to add this second term. Just to finish up, I think we just wanted to describe a little bit of recent work we have been doing on identifying, understanding the social image concerns, how they affect important decisions. We think it's important to understand better, like, mechanisms of social pressure, what are you trying to signal, the interplay of self and social image, some aspects of welfare implications. I think it's pretty hard to do welfare analysis in this world, social image. So there's some work now, but you know, I think more work is needed to understand the evolution of social norms, of course. And I think, you know, there's fortunately there's more and more work on, like, using social incentives as public policy. You know, a lot of people in the room have worked on that too. I think it's a very fruitful area for work, and I think I will just wrap up here. Thank you. Yes. Okay.
So for the record, I feel like I did over comments, but I agree that this was fantastic, fantastic talk. My question about the social comment. I mean, we know that there are limits, right? So if you had to take an example of flat earth believers or something, there's no way people are gonna pass with people transferring from a normal belief to like, oh, now you're looking at flat earth, I guess that's fine. So let me, let me be okay with that. And so in a way, your follow-up experiments with removing the Princeton label and all of that speaks a little bit to the intuition I have when you presented that, and maybe you could share your intuition, which is what is it actually that moderates that people give a pass sometimes and they provide other things. So I'm assuming probably part of your intuition was why you ran this follow-up. Is this probably this room for some sort of Asian updating? I believe there's a room for you to learn something that you might not have known. But if it's too crazy, there's no way I feel okay with that. Because then it's like, you're just an insane person. So what do you think is the limits?
So what is needed is that there's a mass of people who are persuaded by that, right? So you can fool with them. As long as it's plausible that someone believes that, you can fool with them and say, I'm one of them, right? Now, whether people think that you might be persuaded depends on their priors about your type, right? So what you're speculating here, because we don't have enough data on this, we haven't done all the possible experiments, but if people think that you come from a group that is stupid, just believe stuff, persuadable, and so on, it becomes much easier for you to use anything as social cover, right? You think, oh, come on. Just to pick an example, think, oh, Republicans these days, they believe anything. Look, it becomes easier for Republicans to use things as social cover because Democrats think that Republicans believe anything, that they're persuaded, they're gullible, and so on. It becomes easier. But if Democrats hold fellow Democrats to a higher standard, it becomes harder. They say, oh, come on, you know better. You're not going to believe this. You're using this as an excuse. It's not going to work. So I think it's super interesting to understand people's priors about how persuadable your group is. And that relates to stereotypes that people have about different groups and so on. So you can tie up to this whole different aspects. So I think it's super interesting for future work. We just wanted to do some proof of concept of like rationales can help if they're credible. And whether they're credible or not depends on people's priors about your group, right? So
I thought you said proof of work because isn't that the paper that's RNRQD? Is that the paper?
Yes.
Yeah. You like proof of work, but then that's already a top publication.
No.
Yeah.
We'll see. There's still a lot of work we need to do. Yeah. But yeah. Yes.
So basically, how gender and gender-sex languages affect people's attitude towards women participation both in the workforce and in the political arena. Apparently, it might be gender languages are more adapted for women's participation. But when some social norms intervention come up, apparently that difference is reduced. So it's just suggested that it will work, to give a shot because you have got 60 countries.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah.
Regarding women's participation. You have the data, right?
It could be an interesting correlate. Yeah, misperceptions. Yeah. I would suggest. We haven't looked at that. So, yeah, for every dollar that got donated to this cause, many more dollars were donated to another cause. I mean, actually, we're trying to, So that's the thing. The line we're trying to walk here is that we would like to do something that is revealed preference, right? Actual behavior. But some of these things, we don't want to do, right? So that's kind of how we did. We're doing this. Yes.
You just out of curiosity, you mentioned that like women would underestimate their own gender support, and then same with men. Do you have any information about how, like, if they were more accurate about the other gender's support for working?
I think they're slightly more accurate about their own gender, but it seems like something that we're noticing is that it seems from this data that the opinions of men and women are much closer than how they're perceived. So there's much more agreement across society on these topics between men and women than what people think about men and what people think about women. So the differences are smaller than the perceived differences.
I just want to hear more about the type of Carlson case. In the case of the Democrats judging less in the case of reasons given, what do you think is going on? Is it thought like, oh, well, they acted for a reason. It wasn't a very good one, but at least it wasn't just a random opinion of theirs.
It's good. So I think they're different. So the way to think about it is that in the absence of rationale that the person has been exposed to, I might take a lot of their intolerance, right? Now, there's a rationale that it opens up other potential explanations, right? It could be, oh, that person really cares about crime. The person is really concerned, is risk averse. Or it could be that the person just is very persuadable. They just believe anything. I'll give them a pass. So we actually have, for that part of the paper, like asking these Democrats to guess how well the Republican, what score the other person had on a intolerance scale and also on a gullibility scale. And we see that the intolerance scale goes down, the gullibility scale goes up, right? They think less that the person is intolerant and more that they're persuadable. It's one potential shift. We find this. And we also find that Democrats dislike gullible Republicans less than intolerant. So then we need that, right? For judgment to shift. So we have that evidence there to have talk about it. So I think it doesn't need to be that type that is evoked, but it's one potential type. As long as you can move away from something that is really sanctioned, that will serve as social cover. Yeah. Yes. It's a good question. We don't separate that, but it's an important, it's an important consideration we should think about, right? We're just thinking about shifting the mass of people who agree with this. We actually are persuaded by this, but it could be different motives. Yes, I agree with you. We have to think more about it. Yes.
I'm curious about this question earlier about. You said when men, as a misperception of men in Saudi Arabia, about and underestimate how other men support women at work versus women overestimate how other women support. I was just wondering. Is this to do with underneath perception in a society? On the men's side is it's self-flattering. They feel better that I support my wife to go to work, whereas other men don't. So there's this expectation of original norm in the society, whereas on the female side. It's a reverse expectation.
That's a question. I mean, it's something we don't have in that specific context. We don't have data on how women perceive society because the experiments are all done with men in terms of misperception. We do find that these directions of misperception about this specific question of women working outside of home are pretty stable across countries and across gender.
Yeah.
So I think there we have this. There seems to be a clear pattern there. Now the question is where it's coming from. I think it's a super interesting question, and we were trying to understand the root causes of this, and we have some ongoing work on stereotype thinking as a potential source, but we're still working on that. It's what happens in more developed societies is that when we flip is like people think that most women, or basically every woman, will support affirmative action for women, when in fact, most women actually are against affirmative action for women. So that's when we see this flip. But it's for a different question.
But that seems to, when it comes to, it seems to still uncovers underneath expectation, given the very seriously, right? How much expectation plays a role.
It's possible, yes.
Right, seems to come to the middle, if we can independently measure the effect.
I think it's possible. I think we're still trying to document, kind of have a general framework to understand these different patterns, but I think it's possible. Yes. Yes.
A little curiosity. When I was wondering why Warren was not liked as a candidate, before, I was reading an article on the New York Times saying that who are the Democrat electors, the electorate, mostly working class people. You know, people who are gay, sometimes not even educated. And what you say is very interesting, that it seems the Democrats are those that care most about the credibility of the counter justification. So it seems I'm curious, just little curiosity, why Democrats would care more if they are not more intellectual, they are not people with higher degrees on average.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think it has to do a little bit with the sample we're studying, like Democrats on Twitter. So that seems to be more like the liberal elites, you know, in a way. So yes, we and you know, though for the judgment experiment, we recruited sort of representative sample of prolific from sample providers. So it could still be. It's an interesting question. Maybe I don't have a good answer to that. Actually, you know, why we have in a situation where like now they're being held to a higher standard, even though like they're not necessarily on average more educated. That's interesting. Yeah, maybe it has to do with the stereotype. You think when people talk about Democrats on the media, they talk about liberal elites and so on, intellectuals, and maybe that's what I don't know. Is there evidence on how Democrats, what perceptions people have about what Democrats' perceptions are about the education level of Democrats? Do they
was completely.
No, maybe it's right. Maybe other people's are wrong. No, I think maybe interesting to listen. Maybe there's some stereotype. Democrats are intellectual, clever. Yeah, maybe there's some. You know. That's true. Yeah, I agree with you. So this is someone should do that. I mean, hope Ellen has to do it for this paper because we have a lot right there. But I think it's super interesting extension. It has to exactly do with our framework, which is depends on your priors about how persuadable that person is, right? If you fix that person has a PhD, that we expect some rationale not to be effective, right? So it has to do even collecting priors about what do you think is the education level of that person, or manipulate that. So that would get to this. Yeah, I agree with you. Interesting.